When we think of ancient wonders, our minds fly to Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the Maya. But there is a place in North America, hidden in the humid forests of Louisiana, that defies everything we thought we knew about human history. This is Poverty Point. More than 3,000 years ago, while the Trojan War was being fought in Greece and the Olmecs were just beginning their rise in Mexico, a group of people here completed one of the most ambitious engineering projects on Earth. But here's the catch. These people weren't farmers. They had no kings, no wheels, and no metal tools. According to the textbooks, they shouldn't have been able to build this. Yet they moved nearly 2 million cubic yards of earth to create a monumental landscape that still baffles modern engineers. How did a hunter-gatherer society build a megacity? How did they manage a trade network spanning half a continent? Today, we uncover the lost genius of one of the earliest monumental centers in North America. This is the untold story of Poverty Point. And before we begin our journey, I'd love to know where you are joining us from today and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to read through the comments and see how far these stories travel across the world. So let me know below. At first glance, Poverty Point can feel strangely modest, just gentle rises in a wet, flat landscape. But the moment you picture it from above, the whole thing clicks into place, like a drawn plan on the ground. 6 enormous earthen ridges arranged in broad concentric arcs, curving around a central open space, spanning more than 3/4 of a mile across. And then you notice the detail that gives the game away. The ridges aren't sealed loops. They're cut by 4 main aisles, straight radial corridors that run through the arcs in consistent directions. And that kind of order doesn't happen by accident. It takes measuring, pacing, and correcting as the work expands outward. These openings also change how the site feels because they turn the ridges into a navigable layout rather than a barrier. They create routes, sight lines, and a sense that people were meant to move in and out of the center in a structured way, not just wander. That center is the plaza, a huge, intentionally open space that modern descriptions often put at nearly 40 acres. And the most important thing about it is not that it's empty, it's that it's flat, leveled by hand in an environment where the ground naturally wants to slump, puddle, and grow. So maintaining a clean surface would have taken steady effort and attention, not just a single burst of work. Once you let that sink in, you start counting labor differently, because the monument isn't only what rises, it's also what was shaped to stay open and usable. Dominating the view is Mound A, rising roughly 70 feet, broad and massive, the kind of earthwork that makes your body register scale before your brain finds the words. And it sits within a larger spread of features that makes the complex feel distributed, not like one lonely pile in a field. The numbers are where the story turns from impressive to almost hard to absorb, with estimates that the builders moved nearly 2 million cubic yards of earth to create the ridges, the plaza's graded surfaces, and the mounds. And to keep that from sounding like a statistic, it helps to translate it into a picture. To make that number real, if a modern dump truck carries about 52 cubic yards of soil, that's on the order of tens of thousands of truckloads, all moved by hand. The pyramid comparison sometimes comes up here, and it works if you keep it honest, not as a claim that the technologies were the same, but as a reminder that the category of effort is enormous, the kind of effort that requires planning, timing, and a shared commitment strong enough to keep people moving day after day. And Mound A isn't the only marker of that commitment. There are other mounds as well, including Mound B, often treated as an earlier construction, plus additional features like Mound E and smaller earthworks that add up to a built landscape rather than a single spectacle. When you take the ridges, the 4 aisles, the nearly 40-acre plaza, and the spread of mounds as one system, the simplest explanation stops being a big village and becomes something closer to a major project, a place where people were shaping land at a scale that still reads clearly today. The ridges and mounds are the headline. But the question that keeps the whole story honest is much more basic. What fed the people who built this, and what kept them strong enough to keep showing up? Most of us have a reflex answer. Farming, stored grain, a steady surplus that supports specialists and big projects. Yet when archaeologists dig into the everyday debris at Poverty Point, the picture that emerges is different, more fluid, and in its own way more interesting. Instead of clear signs of large fields and staple crops on the scale you'd expect for a permanent, densely packed city, the evidence keeps pointing back to hunting, fishing, and gathering. And if that sounds like a contradiction, it may be because we often imagine foragers as people living on the edge. But many anthropologists use another term for cases like this: affluent foragers, groups who live in environments so productive and know them so intimately that they can prosper without plowing, with enough reliable food to support craft, travel, big social gatherings, and long stretches of shared work. In that model, wealth isn't stored in barns, it's stored in knowledge, in timing, in the ability to read water levels, seasons, migrations, and ripening cycles, and then turn that information into calories on demand. The lower Mississippi world can deliver that kind of abundance, not evenly, not politely, but in strong seasonal pulses. And those pulses matter because they can support large gatherings when the timing is right, the kind of gatherings where a labor force can swell for weeks, then disperse again without the whole system collapsing. The food itself shows up in the most unromantic places, in what people threw away. And those deposits, the middens, are one of archaeology's most valuable sources because they act like a record of repeated habits. Layers of shells, bones, charcoal, and cracked nutshells building up over time. A slow archive of meals, work, and daily choices. From those middens, and from tiny traces preserved in soil samples, researchers see a diet anchored in river and forest. Big fish from nearby waters, deer as a steady source of meat, turtles and other wetland animals that fit naturally into this environment. And on the plant side, heavy, storable foods like pecans and walnuts, along with seasonal fruits such as persimmons, the kind of menu that makes sense when you live where waterways and hardwood forests overlap. What makes this more than a list is how it connects to labor, because storable calories change everything. Nuts can be cached, fish can be dried or smoked, fats can be rendered. And once you can turn a temporary flush of food into something portable and lasting, you can free time for other work, including construction. And that helps explain how a society without the classic signature of large-scale agriculture could still support intense projects, especially if the site functioned as a gathering place that filled up seasonally rather than a dense city that stayed equally packed all year. This is also where the social question becomes unavoidable, because if you're not looking at a state that can simply order people around, then participation has to be motivated in other ways. And anthropology offers plenty of examples where large communal work is powered by reputation, reciprocity, ritual obligation, and the promise that the gathering itself brings benefits: access to trade, access to partners, access to shared identity. In other words, the project doesn't have to run on force. It can run on a social contract, the understood agreement that certain times and places matter enough to travel to contribute to, and to be seen at. Poverty Point begins to look like the physical anchor for that contract, a place that made cooperation visible, where people could meet, exchange goods, share ceremonies, renew alliances, and then turn the energy of the crowd into work that reshaped the land. So the paradox remains, but it sharpens into a new kind of explanation. Complexity here may have grown from ecological abundance, seasonal timing, and collective choice, not from farms and kings. And that's exactly why the site still feels so disruptive to the usual story. It shows that a society can be both foraging and formidable, both non-agricultural and capable of building on a scale most people never expect. Mound A has a way of fooling the eye because it sits there like a natural rise, calm and heavy, as if it simply belongs to the horizon. But the second you think like a builder, it turns into a hard question. How do you pile earth that high in a place where rain can arrive suddenly, soak everything, and turn a slope into a slow-moving collapse? In a wet landscape, earth is a tricky material. It's easy to shape, and it's easy to ruin. And the line between a monument and a mess can be one bad storm at the wrong moment. So when modern researchers try to understand the mound, they don't start with romance. They start with structure. One of the most important projects was led by archaeologist Tristram Kidder and his team at Washington University in St. Louis. They treated Mound A like an object with an interior, not just an impressive exterior. And the way you read an interior that old is by coring, drilling long, narrow shafts into the mound and extracting intact cylinders of soil, like pulling out a vertical timeline you can hold and examine. Those cores are valuable because they keep the sequence of construction, layer on top of layer. And the question they're best at answering is surprisingly simple. Did the builders work in fits and starts over many seasons, or did they raise this thing in one sustained push? Earthworks usually reveal their breaks, because when you dump a layer and walk away, nature does what it always does. Rain beads on the surface, runoff rearranges fine particles, tiny lenses of sand can form, the top oxidizes, and sometimes you see faint biological signatures that say the surface sat open long enough for microlife and weathering to do their work, what archaeologists often call weathering horizons. In the cores from Mound A, many layers appear stacked unusually cleanly, without those obvious resting scenes. And that absence is one reason some researchers argue that the mound may have been built remarkably fast, in a window often described as somewhere between 30 and 90 days, not as a magic number, as an interpretation driven by what the mound does and does not show inside. If you let that timeline sit in your head, the mound stops being a shape and turns into a scene, because the mound holds roughly 238,500 cubic meters of earth, and without machines or draft animals, that volume becomes millions of human trips, earth carried in containers, lifted and dumped again and again until repetition becomes architecture. Researchers often imagine basket loads in the range of 20 to 25 kilograms, heavy enough that you feel it in your shoulders, light enough that it can be repeated. And that range matters because it helps you picture how the work could be organized, not as a fantasy of superhuman strength, but as a system of many bodies doing manageable loads in a relentless rhythm. In that kind of project, carriers are only the most visible part, Because the moment you try to build quickly, you need other roles to keep the structure from turning into a chaotic pile. People locating and preparing borrow areas, people managing traffic so paths don't clog, people directing where loads go so the mound grows evenly, people compacting layers so they lock together, people shaping slopes so water sheds rather than digs in, and people watching the whole form like a living thing, correcting small problems before they become big failures. This is where engineering stops meaning blueprints and starts meaning judgment. Because soil is not just soil, it comes in textures and behaviors, some sticky, some sandy, some prone to slumping, some better at holding an edge. And builders who work with earth learn quickly that stability depends on choosing and placing materials with intention. Layering the right kinds in the right spots, packing them tight, and keeping the angles reasonable for the climate. The Louisiana rain is a teacher you don't get to ignore. And if you build too steep or with the wrong mix, you invite gullies, slumps, and slow collapse. So the very fact that Mound A still stands tall implies choices that were tested against weather and held up. The rapid build argument also carries a social meaning that's easy to miss. Because even if the work took longer than 90 days, even if there were short pauses too subtle to read clearly today, the mound still suggests coordination on a scale that goes beyond a single extended family. It suggests people arriving at the same time, working under shared rules, keeping pace with each other, maintaining continuity long enough for the internal layers to stack cleanly. That kind of continuity needs logistics, food ready in quantity, fuel for fires, water access, places to rest, some way to rotate labor so exhaustion doesn't break the rhythm, and a way to settle conflicts that inevitably arise when a crowd is doing hard work shoulder to shoulder. And it also needs motivation. Not necessarily a king giving orders, but some force strong enough to hold attention, whether that force was tradition, ritual obligation, social prestige, or the simple fact that being part of the project meant being part of the network that met here. It's worth holding the scientific claim with care, because soil doesn't always preserve every pause, and no weathering horizons isn't a stopwatch. But the larger message remains hard to dodge. Mound A was built deliberately, with controlled methods, and with a practical understanding of how Earth behaves in a wet environment. In the end, the mound is not only a monument of dirt, it's a monument of coordination. A proof that more than 3,400 years ago, people here could marshal time, labor, and material knowledge into one stable form and make it strong enough to survive a climate that spends every year trying to pull it back down. It's tempting to think of Poverty Point as a brilliant local achievement, a big project built by people who mostly stayed in their own watery backyard. But the artifacts won't let the story stay that small. Northeastern Louisiana offers mud, clay, reeds, timber, and fish in abundance, but it's poor in the hard stone people elsewhere rely on for everyday tools. So when Poverty Point produces stone tools and stone objects by the hundreds and thousands, one conclusion follows. The stone came from somewhere else, carried by people, moved through relationships, not delivered by geology. And then the identifications widen the world in a way that feels almost cinematic. Copper that earlier researchers often linked to the Great Lakes region, though at least some of it may have come from eastern sources, including the Appalachian region. Galena from the upper Mississippi Valley and the Ozark region, delivered from lands we today call Missouri and Iowa, and stones that point toward the Appalachian Mountains and the Ohio River Valley, Not one dramatic outlier, but multiple streams of non-local material arriving at one place over time. And the simplest way to hear what that means is that Poverty Point sat in the middle of a network large enough to connect half a continent. Trade, though, is never just a pile of objects. Trade is a system of trust. And trust on that scale doesn't run on wishful thinking. It runs on repeated encounters, on reputations, on predictable routes, and on the social rules that let strangers meet without violence. In a world without highways, the rivers do the heavy lifting, and the Mississippi, with its branches and tributaries, becomes a natural transportation grid, a way to move bulky goods in canoes that would be punishing to carry overland. So a chunk of copper or a load of stone can travel in stages, sometimes in the hands of one traveler, sometimes passed along in a chain of exchanges, community to community, until it reaches a convergence point like Poverty Point. This is where the built landscape starts to feel like infrastructure for crowding, commerce, and ceremony. Because a wide, open plaza makes sense if people arrive in waves, if camps spring up around the arcs, if routes funnel movement toward the center, and if the site needs a predictable space where deals can be made, disputes settled, alliances renewed, and rituals staged. And there's a crucial piece that completes the grand Bazaar image, something that doesn't always show up as clearly in the ground as copper and stone do, but shows up in the logic of the place. Exchange has to be two-way. So what did the people here give in return? Archaeologists can't point to one single guaranteed answer, but many have argued that the delta itself could produce portable wealth, and that Poverty Point may have been exporting what it had in abundance and in skill: dried fish that could travel without spoiling, rendered fats that carried calories in usefulness, and crafted items made from local shells, ornaments, and tools that were light, durable, and socially meaningful. Those goods don't always preserve as neatly as stone, and some may have been consumed along the way, which is exactly why they're harder to see today. But the idea fits the environment, because a rich wetland can generate surpluses that can be processed and stored. And once you can store food well, food becomes trade, not just survival. If you imagine the plaza during a peak season, the scene starts to fill in, bundles opened, stone laid out like a promise of sharp edges and hard work, copper flashing in small pieces, shell objects catching light, dried fish traded for toolstone, fats exchanged for pigments or rare minerals, and along with every object, conversation, gossip, marriage negotiations, stories about floods upriver, warnings about travel, invitations to return next season. And the more you picture those human exchanges, the more the monumental earthworks start to feel like a signal, a deliberate announcement written into the ground that this place mattered, that it was safe enough, important enough, and organized enough to host the meeting of distant worlds. There's also a quieter implication, because a hub doesn't just distribute goods, it distributes ideas, techniques, styles, and expectations. And over time, a central place like this can standardize how people make things, how they measure value, how they understand distant groups, and even how they imagine the map of their own world. This is why the stone at Poverty Point is more than exotic material. It's evidence of a continent in motion, a network of communities connected not by an empire, but by roots, relationships, and recurring visits. And if you want a quick modern mental hook, used carefully, not as a claim of sameness, but as a way to feel the role, Poverty Point begins to resemble a kind of ancient downtown, a place where you went to touch the wider world, to trade what your home produced for what it lacked, and to leave with both goods and status, because being seen at the center was part of the value. A place can be rich in food and rich in people, and still be missing something basic. And at Poverty Point, that missing thing was stone, the everyday kind you'd normally use to manage heat. Because stones are the old reliable tool for cooking. You heat them, move them, drop them into pits, line an oven, even bring water close to boiling without relying on abundant cookware. And when stone is scarce, you either accept that limitation or you build a workaround. What makes Poverty Point feel so sharp is that they didn't settle for limitation, they engineered around it. And the evidence shows up as these odd little objects that appear in huge numbers across the site. Hand-formed pieces of fired clay shaped like balls, cylinders, and small loaves. Not decorative figurines, not dishes, but solid heat tools, what archaeologists call Poverty Point objects, PPOs. The name is plain, but the idea behind it is clever, because clay is everywhere in this delta, and when you fire clay, you turn it into ceramic that can absorb heat and then release it steadily, almost like stone. And when you make lots of small pieces rather than one big block, you gain control. You can arrange them like coals without ash. You can distribute them evenly. You can replace cracked ones without losing the whole setup. Sometimes those pieces carry a detail that feels almost unfairly intimate, faint fingerprints pressed into the surface before firing, as if the maker stepped out of the past for a moment and left a signature in plain sight. A reminder that a technology is also somebody's hands, somebody's time, somebody sitting and shaping clay until the form felt right. The likely cooking method, supported by experiments and by the contexts where these objects are found, is straightforward enough to visualize. PPOs are heated in a fire until they're intensely hot. Then they're transferred into earth ovens or cooking pits, where food is wrapped, placed, and covered. And the hot ceramic becomes a bed of stable heat, smoothing out the spikes of flame and the sudden drops that come when a fire dies down. This is where the science is quiet but real, because small ceramic pieces create a more even thermal field than a few large stones. And by choosing shapes that stack and nest, you can build a heat layer that behaves predictably, steady enough to cook through without scorching one side and leaving the other half raw. The high-tech feeling comes from that predictability, from the idea that you can design heat rather than just chase it. And in that sense, the PPOs are less like primitive substitutes and more like deliberate tools tuned to the environment, a way to turn common mud into reusable thermal mass. Their sheer quantity also hints at scale, because when you find large numbers of these objects, you start thinking beyond a single family meal. You start imagining big cooking operations that had to feed crews, visitors, and seasonal surges of people. Situations where cooking reliably matters as much as cooking at all. Food preparation at that scale needs systems, organized fuel collection, consistent oven building, routines for reheating and reuse, and the ability to keep meals moving without chaos. And PPOs fit that need, a modular technology that can be heated, carried, arranged, and used again. They also suggest shared knowledge, because this isn't the kind of thing one person invents once and keeps secret. It's something learned and copied, clay sources chosen, mixtures tested, forms standardized, firing methods passed along, all the small decisions that turn an idea into a tradition. And the bigger point lands gently but firmly. Poverty Point keeps challenging the lazy picture of Stone Age life as limited by lack, because here the lack of stone didn't produce simplicity, it produced innovation. A different branch of engineering that worked with clay, chemistry, and heat, and it did it so well that thousands of years later you can still hold the result in your imagination, right down to the fingerprints on the surface. When you look at Poverty Point long enough, you start noticing that it doesn't just organize land, it seems to organize attention. And that opens a different kind of question, not about trade or food, but about time itself. Some researchers have suggested that parts of the site's layout, especially the ridges and their radial aisles, may relate to where the sun rises and sets at key points in the year, including the summer and winter solstices. And it's important to hold that carefully, because archaeoastronomy can be persuasive and slippery at the same time. Patterns can be real, and patterns can also be something we want to see. But even as a cautious idea, it changes the emotional logic of the place. In a world without written calendars, the sky is the calendar. And in a wet, river-driven environment, timing is not a luxury, it's survival. It decides when fish runs swell, when travel routes open, when storms become more likely, when forests offer their richest foods, and when people can safely move long distances. If a large regional center depended on seasonal visits, then tracking the turn of the year isn't an abstract hobby, it's a practical backbone. And monumental space can make that backbone visible to everyone at once. Imagine standing on the plaza on a cold morning, the horizon low, the air clear for once, and watching the sun rise in a familiar place, framed by a corridor through the ridges. The kind of moment that doesn't require anyone to explain it, because the light itself becomes the announcement. Honestly, moments like that don't just mark time, they pull a crowd into the same rhythm. This is the turning point. This is the signal to begin, to meet, to renew. The open geometry of the site supports that feeling too, because broad, flat space and low horizons make celestial movement easy to observe. And the ridges around you can feel like a built boundary that turns the sky into part of the architecture, an amphitheater for light. There's also the more speculative but hard-to-ignore claim about Mound A, that from above, its outline can be read as a bird-like form. And whether that's a precise intended shape or an interpretive label, it points to something bigger than engineering, the possibility that symbol and landscape were intertwined, that a mound wasn't only a platform, it could also be an image, a being, a story made physical. The idea resonates because across many indigenous traditions in North America, animals and directions are not just decorations, they're part of a cosmic map, ways of describing power, movement, seasons, and the structure of the world. And a landscape that seems to reflect sky events and animal symbolism starts to feel less like a construction site and more like a ritual instrument. None of this requires secret codes, and it doesn't require perfect alignment down to a degree, because the main effect would have been social, a shared reference point that could synchronize people who came from different watersheds and different schedules, helping them agree, silently, on when the year had shifted. So even if the exact alignments are still debated, the broader possibility is compelling. Mound A may have been designed to tie human gatherings to celestial rhythm, to make the turn of seasons visible in the same space where people traded, worked, and celebrated. A place where earth and sky could be read together, and where the stars overhead weren't just background, they were part of the plan. It's easy to get hypnotized by the geometry and forget that the ridges were also a lived surface, a place where real people cooked, repaired, argued, laughed, raised children, and tried to stay comfortable in a humid world that never gives you a clean break. Most of what we know about daily life comes from what was left behind in the least glamorous form: scattered debris on the ridges and in nearby deposits, bits of charcoal and ash from hearths, broken fragments of clay, stone flakes from tool making, animal bone and shell, the small repeated signs of routine. And when you take those fragments seriously, the site starts to feel less like an abstract diagram and more like a place that had a pulse. The food picture matches what you'd expect from a river-rich environment. Fish and deer show up again and again, along with storable nuts and seasonal fruits. And what matters isn't only the menu, it's the way the menu implies planning, storage, and work. Because a community that knows how to preserve food can support bursts of activity that go beyond the needs of a single household. You can also see a world of constant maintenance hiding behind the monuments. Fuel collected for fires, shelters repaired after storms, tools resharpened, clothing and cordage tended, smoke managed, insects endured, water fetched, and the 1,000 little tasks that keep a camp from falling apart, tasks that become even more demanding when the population swells. And honestly, this is where the site starts to feel the most real, not in the grand design, but in the daily grind that kept it functioning. And that's where it helps to widen the picture beyond the usual men hunt, men build frame. Because any place that functions at this scale depends on labor that rarely looks dramatic, but is absolutely central. The kind of work often carried by women and supported by children. Processing food, cracking and grinding nuts, drying fish, tending fires, making and repairing nets, weaving, preparing hides, shaping clay, and keeping households running while larger projects draw people's energy. Children aren't just passengers in that world. They're learners and helpers, carrying small loads, gathering fuel, watching younger kids, absorbing skills by imitation, and turning the ridges into a social classroom where knowledge is passed along in the most practical way, by doing. Even the act of hosting visitors would have had a domestic side, space-making, cooking at scale, sharing water and shelter, smoothing conflicts through everyday routines, all the quiet forms of diplomacy that happen around food and family. And those forms matter because they make a large meeting place sustainable without constant tension. The site may not have been a permanently packed city in the later sense. It may have been a place that filled dramatically at certain times. And if that's true, then daily life included the logistics of hosting, making space, keeping paths open, keeping the central plaza usable, organizing cooking on a scale that matched the crowd, and finding ways to reduce friction when many groups share the same ground. The ridges themselves may have helped with that, not as defensive walls, but as a layout that creates zones, places to cluster activity, places to set up temporary living areas. And the radial aisles act like built pathways that keep movement legible, so the landscape quietly manages traffic the way a well-designed town does. And then there's the artistic side, which arrives like a small shock because it's so delicate. Tiny carved stone objects, owls and figurines shaped with care, often small enough to fit in a hand. And those pieces suggest time, skill, and meaning invested beyond strict survival, a desire to carry identity, story, or spiritual power in a portable form. Art like that also hints at social life, because objects become gifts, symbols of affiliation, markers of personal status or group belonging. And in a place where distant communities met, small, meaningful items could travel and carry relationships with them. The biggest question, though, sits behind all these details. What kind of society held this together? When you see construction on this scale, it's tempting to imagine a powerful central authority ordering labor. Yet Poverty Point doesn't hand us a clear palace, a royal tomb, or the kind of unmistakable hierarchy that settles the debate. Many researchers have argued that it may represent something rarer, a large-scale cooperative project sustained by shared tradition, mutual benefit, and social obligation rather than strict command. A place where leadership could be persuasive and situational instead of permanent and coercive. That doesn't mean there were no leaders. Any complex meeting place has organizers and respected voices. But there's a difference between someone who can convene and someone who can compel. And the archaeological evidence leaves room for both possibilities, which is why the debate stays alive. When you imagine the ridges with cooking smoke hanging low, voices carrying across the plaza, craftspeople shaping clay and stone, travelers arriving with goods and news, and work crews moving in steady lines, the site becomes less mysterious in one sense and more mysterious in another, because it feels intensely human, full of ordinary moments. And instead of sounding like a manifesto, the thought lands like a conclusion you can almost feel. Ordinary lives, linked by agreement and timing, scaling up into something monumental without becoming a kingdom. The disappearance of Poverty Point is harder to process than its rise, because the end doesn't come with a clean, dramatic marker. It comes as a thinning, a quiet tapering off that leaves more questions than answers. Around 1100 BCE, the site stops being used in the same intense way. People stop returning on the old schedule. The routines fade. The maintenance ends, and what's left behind is not a battlefield or a burned city, but a place that simply loses its crowd. Archaeologically, that matters, because when a settlement is destroyed, it leaves a loud signature: ash, smashed objects, hurriedly abandoned goods, sometimes bodies. But here, the record feels more like a decision than a disaster, a long exhale rather than a punch. The first explanation many researchers reach for is the river itself, because the Mississippi world is generous but unstable. Channels shift, backwaters fill, natural levees build and erode, and small changes in water behavior can have outsized effects on a site that depends on access, seasonal resources, and a usable central space. If flooding patterns became more frequent or more intense, if certain low areas began holding water longer, if the approaches to the site became harder to travel, the cost of meeting here could rise quietly year after year until people began choosing other places, not because of one catastrophic flood, but because the margin of comfort narrowed. The same logic applies to food, because a foraging-based system that thrives on seasonal abundance can be resilient, but it's also sensitive to timing, and if the natural calendar shifted, if key fish runs became less predictable, if key resources moved or fluctuated, then the best season for a large meeting might no longer line up with this particular location. Another suspect is the network itself, because hubs only stay hubs as long as people agree they are, and agreement is social, not geological. Trade routes can reorient, alliances can change, reputations can drift, especially across generations. If new centers emerged elsewhere, if communities found other places to meet that were safer, easier, or newly meaningful, then Poverty Point could lose its pull without anyone abandoning it in a dramatic sense. It could simply stop being the obvious choice. There's also the possibility of cultural change that's harder to see in soil, because places like this often run on meaning as much as on practicality. And if rituals evolved, if the sacred geography of a region was reimagined, if a new ceremonial cycle took hold that pointed people to different landscapes, the old center could fall out of rhythm. And when rhythm breaks, attendance drops. And when attendance drops, maintenance becomes pointless. What makes this story feel so different from the fall of a walled city is that the end doesn't have to imply failure. It could reflect flexibility. a recognition that the environment and the social world had shifted, and that the smartest move was to redistribute effort rather than keep investing in a place that no longer returned the same benefits. And once the flow of people slows, the rest happens fast. Vegetation creeps over pathways, rain softens edges, the once kept plaza loses its flatness, and the ridges begin blending into the background, still huge, still present, just no longer actively cared for. The mystery remains because each theory can explain part of the silence, but none can be proven with absolute confidence. And that uncertainty is not a weakness of the story. It's part of what makes Poverty Point feel real, because human landscapes don't always end in flames. Sometimes they end the way relationships end, through drift, through changing priorities, through the quiet accumulation of reasons, until one season arrives and people simply don't come back. Poverty Point leaves behind more than ridges and mounds. It leaves behind a challenge to the way we like to sort human history into neat stages. This place refuses to behave like the standard model, where greatness arrives only with kings, grain, and metal. The evidence points to a monumental landscape built between 1700 and 1100 BCE, more than 3,400 years ago, by people who, as far as we can tell, did not rely on large-scale agriculture and did not build in stone. That combination should feel uncomfortable in the best way because it forces you to widen the definition of what organized society can be. What survives here is not a palace or a written law code. It's a blueprint in earth. Concentric ridges cut by deliberate aisles, a broad central plaza kept open and level by sustained effort, and a towering mound raised through coordination and material skill. And that blueprint carries a message about human possibility. People can align their labor around shared purpose even without an empire standing over them. In that sense, the awakening isn't a sudden flash. It's a long collective realization that a community can choose to think bigger, return to the same center again and again, and invest time and strength into a project that outlives any single season, making that investment visible in the land itself. The trade connections add weight to that idea. Copper and stone arriving from far away are not just objects, they're proof of relationships, roots, and agreements linking distant regions. Even the small technologies speak the same language, like the clay cooking objects that replaced missing stone, sometimes still holding faint fingerprints pressed into their surfaces. It's a small human detail that quietly undercuts the idea that innovation belongs only to later civilizations, because ingenuity is not a timeline, it's a habit of mind. Poverty Point also leaves a lesson about environment that doesn't need to be preached to feel. The builders weren't imposing a fantasy of stability on a volatile landscape. They were working with water, seasonal abundance, river travel, and clay, turning local conditions into strengths. And the fact that the site eventually went silent doesn't erase that skill. It shows how closely human projects are tied to shifting rhythms no one fully controls. What's most haunting is how easy it is to miss all of this if you only search for stone ruins. An earthwork can look like a natural rise until you notice the pattern. And once you see the pattern, you realize the ground is carrying histories that don't announce themselves with columns and walls. Today, that history sits inside something almost disarming in its calm. A quiet park landscape where grass, trees, and open sky soften the edges of the earthworks. Nature and human design have blended so completely that you can stand there in silence and still feel the outline of an ancient decision under your feet. And maybe that's the most human part of the whole story. It doesn't prove that greatness requires kings or fields. It simply shows what can happen when thousands of ordinary choices line up, when people decide to return, to cooperate, to build, and to keep building until the ground itself remembers them. Poverty Point asks to be remembered as a genuine breakthrough in collective organization long before most popular stories allow for it. And when you sit with that realization for a moment, the continent feels different, because the lost worlds are not only across oceans, they are also beneath our feet, written into the soil by hands that left no names, only forms, and a quiet, lasting proof of what humans can build when they decide to build together. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. See you in the next episode, and good night.